Imagine waking up one day to discover that the biggest strategic loss for the United States didn't happen in the South China Sea, nor on the streets of Washington, D.C., but thousands of miles away in Caracas, Venezuela, where an alliance just shifted the balance of global power overnight. When most people think of geopolitical competition between the US and China, they picture advanced missiles, trade wars, or sprawling diplomacy at summits in Asia or Europe, but they rarely picture one of the most consequential battlegrounds being a country whose oil was once among the richest in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela, a nation with some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, became a linchpin for China's economic and strategic penetration into Latin America over the past 2 decades. Beijing didn't just buy oil, it financed Venezuela's survival through massive loans, infrastructure deals, and deep economic ties that made Venezuela one of China's closest strategic partners outside Asia. Those oil-for-loans arrangements helped Venezuela keep its economy alive under heavy sanctions and drew Caracas firmly into Beijing's orbit, creating a relationship that was viewed as a direct challenge to U.S. influence in its own hemisphere. At the same time, the United States watched this growing entanglement with increasing unease. For more than a generation, Washington has treated Latin America as its strategic backyard, honoring a foreign policy principle that tried to limit extra-regional powers' footholds. But China's approach was different, subtle, economic, and patient. Chinese banks became Venezuela's largest creditors. Chinese companies invested in oil production, ports, and industrial complexes. And Venezuelan oil, once routinely shipped to Asia, became a crucial supply line for Beijing. That wasn't just commerce, it was influence. It was a long game that quietly chipped away at U.S. hegemony in a region America had dominated for more than a century. Yet now, in the midst of dramatic U.S. intervention in Venezuela, including the capture of Nicolas Maduro, that carefully built partnership has been thrown into crisis, and Beijing's carefully laid plans could be unraveling faster than anyone expected. The implications are profound, not just for Venezuela but for the broader chessboard of global power, where China is betting big and the U.S. is scrambling to respond. That scramble reveals why Venezuela has suddenly become such a massive win for China against America, even as headlines suggest chaos. Because when you look past the surface drama, what China achieved in Venezuela wasn't about protecting one leader or one regime. It was about permanently altering the rules of engagement in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, U.S. power in Latin America relied on political leverage, financial pressure, and the implicit assumption that no rival superpower could operate there at scale. China shattered that assumption. It proved that, even under extreme sanctions, economic isolation, and political instability, Beijing could step in as lender of last resort, energy buyer, and strategic partner without firing a single shot. Think about what that really means. Venezuela survived years of crushing U.S. sanctions largely because Chinese financing and trade kept the lights on. Oil tankers rerouted. Payments were structured through complex intermediaries. Infrastructure projects continued when Western capital disappeared. Every one of those moves sent a message to the rest of the global South. If Washington cuts you off, Beijing might step in. That message is far more powerful than any speech at the United Nations. It tells countries that U.S. pressure is no longer absolute, no longer final, and no longer the end of the road. And here's the part most people miss. China didn't need Venezuela to succeed economically in the short term. It needed Venezuela to stay aligned. Even a struggling, sanctioned Venezuela still holds leverage simply because of its resources and location. Sitting on America's doorstep, holding vast oil reserves, controlling critical Caribbean access points. By embedding itself so deeply into Venezuela's financial and energy systems, China created a strategic wedge right inside what used to be uncontested U.S. territory. That alone is a historic shift. Now. Consider the timing. The United States is already stretched thin. Military commitments abroad, debt levels at home, political polarization internally. China understands this. So instead of confronting the U.S. head-on, it plays asymmetrically. It picks pressure points. Venezuela was one of the biggest. Not because it was strong, but because it was vulnerable. Beijing exploited that vulnerability with capital, patience, and long-term planning, while Washington relied on sanctions and diplomatic isolation that slowly lost their bite. Even if leadership in Caracas changes, the reality doesn't disappear. Chinese loans don't vanish. Energy agreements don't magically unwind. Infrastructure doesn't unbuild itself. The new Venezuelan reality, whoever governs, is tied to Chinese capital and Chinese leverage. That's the real victory. It's structural. It outlasts presidents, protests, and press cycles. And it forces the United States into a difficult position. negotiate around China's presence, or escalate in ways that risk further instability across the region. This is why Venezuela matters far beyond its borders. It has become a case study, a warning, and for Beijing, a proof of concept, proof that American influence can be diluted, proof that sanctions can be bypassed, proof that economic power, applied patiently, can reshape geopolitics without war. And that realization is now spreading to other countries watching closely, asking themselves one dangerous question. If China could do this in Venezuela, where else could it happen next? And that question is exactly what keeps U.S. strategists up at night. Because Venezuela was never meant to be an isolated case. It was a template. China tested how far economic gravity alone could pull a country away from Washington's orbit, even one sitting in America's own neighborhood. And the results were undeniable. While the U.S. applied pressure through sanctions and diplomatic isolation, China applied patience, years of it, quietly absorbing short-term losses in exchange for long-term positioning. That is a very different mindset, and it's one the United States has struggled to counter. Look at the broader pattern. Once China proved it could operate inside a sanctioned economy like Venezuela, other governments started recalculating their risks. If Beijing can finance oil production under sanctions, build infrastructure without Western approval, and still secure repayment through commodities, then U.S. leverage suddenly looks conditional, not absolute. That's the shift. Power didn't flip overnight, but confidence did. Countries began to see options where none seemed to exist before, and geopolitics is often less about power itself and more about the belief that power can be resisted. This is where America's response ran into trouble. Sanctions were designed to force political change, but instead they created a vacuum. China filled that vacuum, not with ideology, not with lectures about governance, but with cash, Contra, CTS, and long timelines. Washington assumed economic pain would break alignment. Beijing assumed economic dependence would lock it in. In Venezuela's case, China's assumption proved far more durable, and here's the uncomfortable truth. Even if the U.S. regains some influence in Caracas, it can't erase what happened. China demonstrated it can challenge U.S. dominance without matching military strength, without controlling global institutions, and without winning public opinion. It simply embedded itself so deeply into the economic foundation of a vulnerable state that removing it became nearly impossible. That's not a tactical win, that's a strategic one. This also reframes how future conflicts will play out. The next great power competition won't always be loud. It won't always involve troops or missiles. Sometimes it will look like loan agreements, port upgrades, oil shipments, and quiet diplomatic visits. Venezuela showed how a weakened country can become a battlefield of influence without ever declaring a side publicly. And China walked away with proof that its model works, even under direct American pressure. The final conclusion is this. Venezuela didn't just become a partner for China, it became evidence. Evidence that the world is no longer unipolar. Evidence that U.S. pressure has limits. And evidence that economic strategy can outperform political coercion when time is on your side. For America, Venezuela is a warning that old tools no longer guarantee old outcomes. For China, it's confirmation that patience, capital, and positioning can rewrite the global balance quietly, effectively, and permanently.